So I think most of you were here last time, but because it has been a little while since we had the previous session, I know we had, I think, a first Friday, and I was away, and this, not the other, so I spent a little bit. Just a brief recap, very, very brief, that there were persecutions of the church going back 100 years or more. Some of them were really pretty severe, too, in terms of restricting the action of the church and so on. And in fact, that reminds me of a comment from one of my favorite Catholic intellectuals of all time, Juan Donoso Cortés. I've made references to him off and on in sermons, so maybe that you've heard me mention that name before. But he has a fascinating observation that I agree with. He says, the difference between a good government and a bad government is, no matter what form it takes on paper, is whether the church is free to act. If the Catholic Church is free to act and do what she is here to do, then whatever form of government you have on paper is at least tolerable. But if the church is not free to act, then again, it doesn't matter what your official form is, it's not a good government, right? So in the U.S., we have supposed to have a constitutional system, debatable whether it's really being followed. But then under the previous administration, they were really putting some things that were really very oppressive of the church, you know. So again, the big question is the church free to act or not? That is the big question. And if the answer is yes, Donoso Cortés would say, and I agree with him, that at least that form of government, whatever it may be, is at least tolerable or even positively good. So anyway, as I say, there were a lot of restrictions put on the church off and on. Some of these were kind of ignored. Some of them were more enforced. There were armed conflicts before. As we know, there was one about 70 years before the Cristero War of the 1920s, right? So that would put it in the 1850s, I think, right? We talked about it last time. Also, so you know, I am recording these, and once the whole series is done, we'll post the whole batch. The problem is our sessions have been a little bit sporadic here, so I figure once we get the whole thing done, we can post the whole batch. If in the meantime, Rob is recording, but also if you want to catch me as well, you can certainly contact me and say, hey, can you give me the recording? I'll be glad to do that, no problem. The goal is really to put it online so that everybody can get to it eventually. So, okay? Any questions from last time before we press ahead with the new material? I foresee that we might need maybe 2 more sessions, maybe 1. It all depends. So we'll see, but 1 or 2 more sessions should do for sure. Okay. So remember that we have all these generals who come in. Some of them have very short reigns. Porfirio Diaz had a very long reign, even though he claimed to be in favor of term limits. And nearly all of them were pretty hostile to the church, at least off and on. But then the worst of them all up to this point was the General Plutarco Elias Calles, who ruled Mexico from 1924 to 1929. And lest I touch off your anger after you hear about the Cristiada, I'll go ahead and mention this one first. But keep it in the back of your mind. Fake news is nothing new. Absolutely nothing new. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of time. Did God really say, right? But the leyenda negra of the time of the Reformation and so on, post-Reformation time. But fake news is nothing new. And here is what the well-respected, esteemed, prestigious Encyclopedia Britannica says. I looked it up. This is brand new. I mean, this is what you find right now. This is not an old edition. Here's what it says about Plutarco Calles. His term was marked also by difficulties with the Roman Catholic Church and the United States. He applied the constitutional provisions that limited the number of clergy and prohibited church schools. The church, as a consequence, held no public religious services for 3 years until the dispute was arbitrated in 1929. Period. Difficulties, the violent persecution and death, bloody deaths of thousands and thousands of people, all get swept under the rug and described as difficulties. And that's Encyclopedia Britannica, which is prestigious and reputable. So be careful. That's one reason too I'm so big on using Father Irabaru, because he's done his homework and he's very solid, and he's going to tell you the true story. He's not going to tell you a bunch of nonsense like that. Okay? All right. Oh yeah, there is no entry for Cristiada at all, and there is a reference to the word Cristero in 2 other articles, 2 brief references. That's it. So there's no reference to the Cristiada either at all in the encyclopedia. All right, getting back to Father Irabaru. Reforming the penal code, the Calles Law of 1926 expelled foreign priests, punished with fines and prison whoever gave religious instruction or established primary schools, or dressed as a cleric or religious, or reunited after having been expelled from a convent, or led others to religious life, or carried out acts of worship outside of churches. Repeating the trick from the times of Juarez, this time too, from a secretariat of the Calles government, came the ridiculous attempt to create a schismatic Mexican church. This time around a precarious patriarch named Perez, who in the end died in communion with the church. The governors of the various Mexican states rivaled one another in persecutorial zeal, and so the governor of Tabasco, General Garrido Canaval, a corporatist despot in the style of Mussolini, was a womanizer, required priests to get married if they wished to exercise their ministry. In Chiapas, a, quote, law of social prevention against the insane, degenerate, drug addicts, alcoholics, and vagrants makes the provision that, quote, they could be considered to be lowlifes and subject to measures of security, such as being put away in sanitaria, prisons, forced labor, and such, professional beggars, prostitutes, priests who operate without legal authorization, people who celebrate religious acts in public or who teach religious dogmas to youth, homosexuals, the producers and sellers of religious articles, as well as the publishers of books, pamphlets, or any other publication intended to inculcate religious prejudices. And so you can see that those who practice and profess their religion are lumped right in with beggars, prostitutes, other lowlifes, etc., all lumped in there under this law. The next session is about the cessation of cult that took place on July 31st, 1926. July 31st, incidentally, is the feast of St. Ignatius Loyola, as you may remember. The Mexican bishops, in an energetic pastoral letter of July 25th, 1926, protested unanimously, manifesting their decision to work so that, quote, this decree and the anti-religious articles of the Constitution would be reformed, and we will not cease until we see it done. President Calles responded coldly, quote, we have limited ourselves to carrying out laws that already exist, one of them from the reform of more than half a century ago, and the other from 1917. Naturally, my government has no thought whatsoever of mitigating the reforms and additions to the penal code. And so again, it's an attempt to look as though, well, this is all just settled law, there's no changing it, we're just enforcing the laws that are on the books, you don't like it, too bad. It comes down to a sort of legal positivism. Are you all familiar with what legal positivism is?
Say what it is.
So briefly, you could look it up and probably get a better, more exact discussion of it, but what it comes down to in practice is that whatever written law you have is supreme, and you can make whatever written law you want. And so if you have a definition of marriage that's given to us by God himself because he's the one who created us and created our nature, well, nevertheless, you sweep that away and you say that marriage can be something different. And then if it goes on the books as being the law or a court decision, well then presto chango, there you are. It's changed by fiat, by the power, by those who have power. That's legal positivism. And so again, legal positivism is always the technique of every oppressive government. From what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, please let me know, I will make a public correction. But from what I know, everything the National Socialist government of Hitler did was legal. They went through the process, they got the laws put on the books, and then they went and did what they did. So again, legal positivism is always the tool of horrible oppression. Okay, so Irabaru continues. This was the tolerance of liberals before the fanaticism of Catholics. They only asked the Catholics to obey their laws, right? A few days later, on July 31st, having consulted with the Holy See, the Mexican Episcopate ordered the suspension of public cult throughout the country. Immediately, a dozen bishops, among them the Archbishop of Mexico City, were brusquely taken from their sees and, without any judicial process, expelled from the country. One must assume that the Callistas, the followers of Calles, had received the suspension of religious cult with coldness, and even with a certain satisfaction. They did not expect, and neither did the majority of the bishops, the reaction of the Christian populace at being deprived of the Eucharist and the sacraments, at seeing altars stripped and sanctuaries empty with the door wide open. The Cristero Cecilio Valtierra tells of that experience with the native eloquence of the people. Quote, "The church was closed, the sanctuary was a desert, it remained empty. God was no longer there. He went away to be the guest of whoever wanted to give him a place, already fearing condemnation by the government. Now the ringing of the bells was no longer heard, the call to the sinner to come and pray. Only one consolation remained to us, that the door of the church was open, and in the evening the faithful went to pray the rosary and deplore their sins. The people were in mourning. Joy was gone. Now there was no well-being or peace. The heart felt heavy, and to top it off, the government prohibited meeting in the street, which we used to do, so that people could spend time together, for this was made a serious crime." And that's the end of the quote from the Cristero Cecilio Valtierra. Now, in the middle of August, on the occasion of the assassination of the priest of Chalchuites and 3 lay Catholics with him, there arose in Zacatecas the first point of an armed movement. And right away in Jalisco, in Huejutla, where on the 29th of August the people raised the shout of fidelity, "Viva Cristo Rey." And Jalisco, remember, is where Guadalajara is, and we have our apostolate there. Between August and December of 1926, there were 64 armed uprisings, spontaneous, isolated, for the most part in Jalisco, Guanajuato, Guerrero, Michoacán, y Zacatecas. And all of those, by the way, you kind of know the general shape of Mexico. They're kind of in the central western part. They're all pretty much neighboring states. Those whom the government derisively called Cristeros did not have arms at the beginning, other than machetes, or if one was more fortunate, a shotgun. But soon they were acquiring them from the federal soldiers, the Johnny Callistas, in guerrilla and surprise attacks. So basically they acquired all their weapons from the military itself, from the federal forces. The acquisition of munitions was always a problem for the Cristeros. In reality, quote, "they had no other source of munitions than the federal army from whom they took them or bought them." In Arandas, in a town of Los Altos, as J.J. Hernandez relates, new contingents came from all the ranches, quote, "some arming themselves even with rosaderas. This is, I had to look this up. It's like a long sort of a curved knife. It almost sort of like a sickle. They use them to, I believe they use them to harvest the agave plant that you make tequila from, right? Hatchets, and from the ranches that people knew had arms, they went to obtain them. It was pitiful to see these people. Some, in addition to bearing poor weapons, carried sandal straps, their sombreros torn and falling apart, their clothing all patched. Others went bareback on their horses, some even without reins, and others only on foot. At the front of the movement, in order to give it a unity of plan and action, was the National Defense League of Religious Liberty, founded in March of 1925 with the purpose that its name expresses, and which had extended in a short time through all the Republic. The uprising was expressed in this way in a letter from a rural Cristero, as nearly all of them were, Francisco Campos of Santiago Payacora in the state of Durango. On the 31st of July of 1926, some men acted so that the Lord our God would be absent from his churches, from his altars, from Catholic homes, but other men acted so that he would return again. These men did not see that the government had very many soldiers, many weapons, and a great amount of money to make war against them. They did not regard them. What they did see was to defend their God, their religion, and their mother, which is the Holy Church. This is what they saw. To these men it did not matter to leave their homes, parents, children, and spouses that they had. They went to the fields of battle to seek the Lord our God. The rivers, mountains, and hills are witnesses of the fact that these men spoke to our Lord God with the holy name, Viva Cristo Rey, Viva la Santísima Virgen de Guadalupe, Viva Mexico. The same places are witnesses that these men shed their blood in this soil, and not content with that, they gave their own lives so that our Lord God would come back again. And our Lord God, seeing that these men truly sought him, he deigned to come back to his churches, altars, and Catholic homes as we see at present. And he charged the youth of today that if in the future it comes to having to make a similar sacrifice, that they not forget the example that their ancestors left them. And that is from Francisco Campos. Before we make a chronicle of this martyrial war, we need to take a moment to analyze with care, because the question is very serious, the attitude of the ecclesiastical hierarchy towards the Cristeros. Let us pay attention to the dates. October 18th, 1926. In Rome, Pius XI receives a commission of Mexican bishops who inform him of the situation of persecution and armed resistance. A few days later, after having posed the question to Cardinal Gaspari whether prelates could use the goods of the church for their armed defense, he replied that he, the Secretary of State to the Holy Father, if he were a Mexican bishop, would sell even his gems to do so. November 18, 1926, so 1 month later. 1 month later, the Pope publishes his encyclical Iniquis Afflictisque, in which he denounces the outrages suffered by the church in Mexico. Quote, "Now there remains almost no liberty to the church in Mexico, and the exercise of sacred ministry is so greatly impeded that it is punished as if it were a capital crime with the most severe penalties." The Pope praises with enthusiasm the National League in Defense of Religious Liberty, extended through all the Republic, where its associates work together and diligently to form and instruct all Catholics to present a united and rock-solid front of opposition to their adversaries. And he is moved before the heroism of the Mexican Catholics, some of them adolescents, some of them youth, how to hold back tears in thinking of it, have cast themselves before death with a rosary in their hands and the shout, "Viva Cristo Rey." Words cannot describe the spectacle that is offered to the world, to the angels, and to men. And that was from Pius XI. November 30th, 1926. The directors of the National League, before assuming fully the direction of the Cristero movement, wanted to assure themselves of the support of the episcopate. And for that purpose, they directed to the bishops a memorandum in which they solicit the following. Number one, a negative action, which consists in not condemning the movement. Two, a positive action, which consists in the following 4 points. A, maintaining a unity of action in conformity with a single plan and a single leader. B, forming the collective conscience in the sense that one is dealing with an action that is licit, praiseworthy, meritorious, of legitimate armed defense. C, facilitating canonically the existence of battlefield vicariates. D, urging and sponsoring an energetic solicitation from wealthy Catholics so that they would supply funds for the fight, and that even if just once in their life, they understand the obligation that they have to contribute. On November 30th, the leaders of the League were received by Monsignor Ruiz y Flores and Monsignor Diaz y Barreto. The first of these communicated jovially to them that, as usual, they got away with it. Having studied their proposals, the bishops of the commission joined in session, approved the various points of the memorandum unanimously, except for the last two, concerning battlefield vicariates and soliciting funds from the wealthy, as being unfitting or unrealizable. January 15th, 1927, the Episcopal Committee, responding to various incriminating declarations by the Caísta Jefe del Estado Mayor, affirms that the episcopate is not connected to the armed uprising, but declares at the same time that, quote, there are circumstances in the life of peoples in which it is licit for citizens to defend by force of arms legitimate rights which they have tried in vain to have secured by peaceful means. And they relate all the peaceful means attempted by the bishops and people which were disregarded by the government. Quote, it was thus that the prelates of the Catholic hierarchy gave their full approval to Mexican Catholics to exercise their right to armed defense, which the Holy See had foreseen would come as the only means that remained to them in order not to subject themselves to anti-religious tyranny. And that is from Rios, page 135. January 16, 1927. At the beginning of 1927, nevertheless, press reports arrived at Rome, which communicated that Monsignor Pascual Diaz y Barreto, I just referred to him, the Bishop of Tabasco, who had been exiled from Mexico, in various declarations made in exile, showed reservations about the Cristeros. Quote, as a bishop and as a citizen, and Diaz rejects revolution, whatever the cause may be. Immediately, the 16th of January, the Commission of Mexican Bishops sent a firm letter to Bishop Diaz y Barreto, who was then residing in New York, lamenting with deep sadness his public declarations made, quote, against the generous defenders of religious liberty and certain statements favorable to the persecutor Calles. The combatants, quote, are giving their blood and their lives to fulfill a holy obligation, that of obtaining the liberty of the Church. Before the gravely unjust abuse of power exists the right to resist and to defend oneself, since all peaceful means have ended up in vain, which have been tried, and thus it is just and obligatory to have recourse to resistance and to armed defense. The bishops also remind him that this, quote, is the sentiment of the majority of our brother bishops in Mexico, and even that of the fathers of the company, the Society of Jesus, because I think I skipped mentioning that this Bishop Diaz y Barreto was a Jesuit, not only in Mexico, but also in Europe, and especially in Rome. They go on to cite to him the declarations made a few days earlier, March 2nd, 1927, by the famous moral theologian of the Gregorian, the Jesuit University in Rome, Father Vermesch, who says this, quote, this is Father Vermesch, moral theologian, they do very evilly, who, believing that they are defending Christian doctrine, disapprove armed movements. For the defense of Christian morality, it is not necessary to turn to false pacifist doctrines. The Catholics in Mexico are utilizing a right and fulfilling a duty. A short time afterwards, there arrived a cablegram with the answer of Bishop Diaz y Barreto. Quote, I authorize the Honorable Commission to deny that which is claimed to be said by me, which runs contrary to that which was determined by all of us, approved and blessed by the Holy See. I authorize the Honorable Commission to publish this message if they wish. And so what we see here, if we take the bishop at his word then, is again an instance of fake news. That's exactly what it is. They floated these comments that, oh, he was expressing his reservations about it, and then the bishops responded to him, and he wrote back and said, look, I did not say this. I did not say this. So if we take him at his word, we can see, again, manipulations through the media. It's nothing new, nothing new. And it's going to continue, by the way. It always does, right? February 22nd, 1927, Feast of the Chair of St. Peter, by the way. In Rome, the president of the Commission of Mexican Bishops declares to the press, quote, do Catholics do good or evil by having recourse to arms? Up to this point, we had not been willing to speak, lest we be precipitous in our judgment of events. But once Calles himself pushed the citizens to armed defense, we must say that the Catholics of Mexico, as do all human beings, enjoy in all its fullness the natural and inalienable right to legitimate defense. May 17th, 1927. Some years before the events that concern us now, in 1914, St. Pius X, upon the petition of the Mexican bishops, had authorized as a, quote, project more welcome than we can express, to consecrate the Republic of Mexico to Christ the King, and to put a royal crown in the images of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, placing a scepter in his hand to signify his kingship. The consecration of Mexico to Christ the King, a seemingly impossible thing compared to that realized by Garcia Moreno in Ecuador in 1873, nevertheless was able to become a reality, taking advantage of the permission granted by General Victoriano Huerta, who was president 1913 to 1914, who was a pure Indian from Jalisco, and who, by a rare circumstance, was a Catholic and not a Mason. In fact, he was hated and slandered by the Masonic lodges. It was then, on January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, during this most solemn act which took place in the cathedral, in the presence of all the highest religious and civil authorities of the nation, when for the first time in Mexico, the Christian people raised the cry, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. And so then, at the beginning of the Cristiada, so this was back in 1914, so then, at the beginning of the Cristiada on May 17, 1927, were communicated to the Mexican bishop certain responses and licenses from Rome. And in the document it says this, quote, another rescript that we have received concedes to those who are in Mexico a plenary indulgence in articulo mortis, at the point of death, if having confessed and received Holy Communion, or at least with contrition, they pronounce with the lips, or at least in the heart, the ejaculatory prayer, Viva Cristo Rey, accepting death as being sent by the Lord in punishment for our sins. Jean Meyer denies the existence of this unusual document, or unfamiliar document, but later Lopez Beltran reproduced a photograph of it in his work on the Cristiada. October 2nd, 1927, Feast of the Holy Guardian Angels. Cardinal Gasparri, whom we've seen already, Secretary of State for the Holy See, and certain statements that the New York Times relates the horrors of the persecution suffered in Mexico by the church and denounces the silence of the nations, quote, for tolerating such a savage persecution so far into the 20th century. Let me press the pause button. Have we not seen all the very same stuff with Iraq? The very same thing, all the persecution of the Christians, because Iraq had a large Chaldean Catholic population. I don't know if you knew that. Hundreds of thousands. And Saddam Hussein was a horrible, horrible man. There's really no doubt about it. But he was enough of a zookeeper that he could actually keep people from killing each other.
The Christians were actually safer under him.
They were safer under him. They were. And he actually had a Catholic in his cabinet. I forget who it was now. Name on came to me. But this whole thing, ISIS goes around chopping all these people's heads off, and the rest of the world is like ho-hum, nary a peep, and very little action. So, I mean, you see this recurring over and over and over again. So, up to this point then, the episcopacy has been very supportive, and even Rome has been very supportive, and things look very positive, right, for the support of the Cristiada. But unfortunately, there start to be cracks in the cement, and that's what we'll see at this point. As the months passed, the reservations the church had in supporting the Cristeros increased, even in Rome. Let us remember that the traditional doctrine of the church recognizes the legality of armed rebellion against civil authorities only under certain conditions. Number one, a cause that is very grave. 2, exhaustion of peaceful means. 3, that the violence employed not cause even greater evils than those it intends to remedy. And 4, that there be some probability of success. Those are the 4 classic criteria for Catholic just war theory. That is from Pius XI, Firmissimam Constantiam, 1937. So if you want the exact reference on that, I've got it here. You can check it out. Okay. So for my own part, this is my own opinion. You may take it or leave it. If I am mistaken, please correct me and show me why I'm mistaken. But for my own part, I believe that number 4 virtually always is the case. Number 4 says that there be some probability of success, because God has brought about miraculous victories over and over again, contrary to expectation. Some of those miraculous victories are recorded in the Bible, but there have been many, many others since that time. So again, if you have God on your side, and sometimes we can truthfully say that, right? If you have God on your side, then your odds of winning go way, way up, right? So there can be some probability of success, right? It doesn't mean that one should be presumptuous, right? Or absolutely foolish, but one should definitely not put limits on God's action and intervention, okay? So in other words, as it says, I forgot to look up the reference, sorry about that, but it says in St. Paul, whatever does not proceed from faith is sin, right? You need to have that faith in God at all times in whatever you do and everything you do, right? But if you are proceeding in faith and you have confidence in God and trust in God that He will save you and that He will bring His justice, then I think you can have that belief that there would be some probability of success. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So let me do a bit of a digression here, although I think it's important. I'm glad this occurred to me, and I hope that you find it worthwhile to go even further. So I'm going to depart from Father Irabaru here for a little bit. This is from Father John Hardin, servant of God, Father John Hardin. Very, very, very good, very solid Jesuit. This is from a book that he wrote on ecclesiology called Christ to Catholicism. If you know the discs that I give away, it's on there. If you have trouble finding it, let me know. I'll show you where it is. It's on there. It's kind of, I don't know if you can even obtain it in print, but I have it on there. And this is from Christ to Catholicism. And he's talking about the mystical body of Christ, and he says this: profession of the true faith. Valid baptism, however, is not enough for actual membership in the mystical body. It is further necessary to believe and profess the true faith. This means that, quote, all those things are to be believed with divine and Catholic faith which are contained in the Word of God, written or handed down, and which the church, either by a solemn judgment or by her ordinary and universal teaching, proposes for belief as having been divinely revealed. Two obligations follow as a consequence, one external and the other known only to the person himself. Externally, in keeping with the church's visible character, quote, the faithful are obliged to profess the faith of Christ as often as their silence, evasion, or manner of acting would implicitly amount to a denial of faith, contempt of religion, an offense to God, or scandal to the neighbor. The implicit denial and contempt of religion are clear enough, meaning that if the circumstances allow only one option to those who witness my silence, either that I am denying my faith or that Catholicism is not objectively true, I must openly profess what I internally believe. The offense against God is described by St. Thomas in terms of supernatural charity. The end of faith, he says, should be referred to the end of charity, which is the love of God and the neighbor. And therefore, when the honor of God or the benefit of the neighbor requires, a man cannot be satisfied with being personally united by faith to divine truth, but he must confess his faith externally. And that's the conclusion of the quote from St. Thomas. Father Hardon says, finally, I must give outward expression to my hidden convictions if there is a danger that others would be turned away from the faith by seeing the silence of a person who is supposed to believe. Okay? Great statement from Father Hardon there. Absolutely great. Again, if you want the reference on that, it's on the disc. Or you can copy it from here or whatever. But that's worth reading several times. And again, I'll make the observation here that in a certain light, if we look at it, it's a question of bearing false witness, right? If we stay silent and do nothing and just stand there, and that is construed as a witness, then it is bearing false witness, isn't it? Does that make sense? So yeah, there are times, again, the principles, a digression to a digression, the principles of fraternal correction, one of those is that if it's not going to do any good, then just leave it alone and hold your tongue, right? However, that has its limits. If your silence is going to be seen as false witness, and that they think you're going to go along with their error, then you have to speak up even if it isn't going to do any good. Does that also make sense? And so I think the Cristeros are completely justified all the way. I think they meet all four criteria in spades. To me, this is an exceptionally clear case. Or the Christians in Iraq or the Middle East who are fighting ISIS. Absolutely. They meet all these criteria in my mind. There's no question about it. Yeah, question?
I have another question on that, the fourth point that you mentioned.
Yeah, that there be some probability of success.
Yeah, that one. Is there, would you make a distinction, I guess, between like a group like the Cristero, making a taking preemptive action versus, like, say, the federal government is at their doorstep, then even if that, fourth point was not there, would you say that they would still have a right at least to attempt to defend themselves, even if they know they're going to go down in the process?
My answer, again, I don't want to run afoul of Catholic teaching here, but again, by extension of what I just quoted from Father Hardon, I would say yes. And in fact, that's the very next thing I have here is a thought for your consideration. This is my own personal opinion. Take it or leave it. If I'm mistaken, please correct me. But sometimes you fight and you lose. But the real question is, what do you lose if you don't fight? Do you lose your soul? Right? So sometimes you fight and lose, but you have to think, if I don't fight, the loss could be my soul. It could be the loss of souls under my care. Right? Yeah.
Well, that was a discussion I remember having with a group of people. And they saw the Cristeros as a failed counter-revolution, but it wasn't in the end because what they got was the mass.
We'll see how it turns out.
they didn't get the mass?
Well, they did, but we'll see. It's a story that it's not a very happy ending.
Okay.
And unfortunately, like the movie For Greater Glory, kind of sugarcoats it.
Okay.
So we'll get there. Father Robert does talk about that.
Okay.
I mean, there was, yeah,
So-
yeah, we'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there. Now, if you want to go really extreme, I'll just quote my friend Tomas Dagarmesh, God rest his soul. He's a great man and a great Catholic, but he gave a speech at the Autónoma, the university, the Autonomous University in Guadalajara. This would have been in the 1950s, I think it was, or maybe the 60s, probably 60s. I wish I had that speech. Unfortunately, he died and his widow had to move and stuff, so I think it just got lost in all his papers. But I remember reading it, and I remember this statement from there. He says, the enemies of truth must be fought with rosaries in one hand and, if necessary, machine guns in the other. So, thank you, Tomas Dagarmesh. Rest in peace. Good soldier. All right, back to Father Iraburu. And so then, the persecution of Calles clearly met the first two conditions, namely very grave cause and exhaustion of peaceful means. No disagreement about that. But certain bishops had doubts about the third, i.e. that the violence would not cause even greater evils. For a long time was passing in which the people were left without the assistance of the sacraments and priests, and the war produced more and more deaths and violence. And more people than not believed that the victory of the Cristeros was actually very unlikely. So even though their hearts may have been with it, many people probably thought, they haven't got a chance anyway. There did not lack even certain bishops who came to the point of threatening with excommunication those who were with the Cristeros or who helped them. Approving the armed rebellion were the bishops Manriquez y Zárate, González y Valencia, Lara y Torres, Mora y Del Rio, and also very sympathetic to the Cristeros were the bishops of Colima, Velasco, and the Archbishop of Guadalajara, Orozco y Jimenez, who at great personal risk remained hidden. These bishops remained hidden in their dioceses, helping their people. Rejecting armed rebellion to a greater or lesser degree were various other bishops, among them Ruiz y Flores of Morelia, and Pascual Diaz of Tabasco, but later of Mexico City, who always saw the Cristiada as a fruitless sacrifice condemned to failure. Most remained undecided. And so then, as the third and fourth conditions for a just war remain debatable, it is necessary to avoid all harsh historical judgment, which casts upon these bishops the titles of faithful or unfaithful, valiant or cowardly. In any case, it is evident that the lack of clearer support on the part of the bishops was always the greatest suffering for the Cristeros. January 18, 1928. Finally, around the middle of December 1927, Archbishop Pietro Fumasono Bondi, apostolic delegate to the United States and charged with the negotiations of the apostolic delegation in Mexico, transmitted to Monsignor Diaz y Barreto, we've seen him before, Secretary of the Episcopal Committee, whom the same Archbishop Fumasono had named official intermediary between himself and the Mexican bishops, the disposition of the Pope according to which, quote, the bishops not only should abstain from supporting armed action, but should also remain outside and above any political party, a norm which Monsignor Diaz communicated to all the prelates on January 18, 1928. Many peasants, especially in the central part of Mexico, took to a mountain like Francisco Campos. He was the one that we heard that really, really beautiful quote from, right? Kind of long, beautiful quote about the sacrifices they were making, right? To seek our Lord God. In Cocula, Jalisco, from the 1st of August, the church was permanently guarded by 100 women on the inside and 150 men in the atrium and bell tower, night and day. 5 neighborhoods took shifts and sounded the alarm whenever needed. Then everyone came in an instant, as Porfiria Morales relates. She says, on August 5th, they rang the alarm bell when she was in her kitchen, and her servant Maria exclaimed, Ave Maria Purissima. She took off her apron, took a scarf and a club, and when Porfiria asked where she was going, she replied, what kind of question is that, ma'am? Don't you hear the bell that is calling Catholics to the union, to the popular union? The things of God come first. And she went out, leaving the pans on the fire. And that's all I have ready for tonight. But just an amazing, amazing story. Any questions or comments at this point? Yeah.
I have a question about, I don't know if this is or not, but just about the obedience issue. You said there's four parts, and then there's the disagreement on the number 3 and 4. And so the local bishops were torn, it sounds like, on all sides of what to do.
Right.
So what's your take on that? Because that could be a very difficult situation when you're talking about obedience to your local ordinary. When things are, I mean, they seem clear to the laity, but maybe, so what happens then?
So yeah, in other words, how do you square the armed action with the need to be obedient to the bishop, right? I would say a couple of things could come into play there that just muddy it even further, okay? But when you're dealing with something very, very grave and very urgent and very dangerous, you can't have just someone who's in a chancery 100 miles away sitting in his armchair. I'm sorry, but you have to make concrete, real decisions in the here and now on what we face, right? And we know even in America, we know there's a very, very big difference between the middle part of it, flyover country, and the Northeast and California. We know that. And so what might be perfectly justifiable in a place like those, should it come to it, might not be the situation here. So you have to make a concrete and practical judgment of the intellect. That's what conscience is, by the way. You do know that, right? It's a judgment of the intellect, whereby we make a judgment about the moral quality of an action where we have either done or doing or going to do, right? So it's not how we feel or an impulse or just a reaction or whatever. It's like, this is right or this is wrong. And in fact, this might seem a bit of a digression, but I think it will shed some light. So if you bear with me, how are we doing on time? Pretty good, 7:20?
26.
Oh, mine. So we're a little close. I'll try to keep this brief. So I tend to think in terms of 3 broad regions, okay? Some things are absolutely forbidden, off limits, no way, right? Thou shalt not. Other things are absolutely required. You must do them, right? But other things are neither forbidden nor required. So you could do them because they're not forbidden. But you would not have to do them because they're not required. And that area of discretionary, optional things is where prudence comes in. That's where you need the cardinal virtue of prudence, to make those decisions on those things that are morally licit but not necessarily obligatory, right? And again, on something like this, if your bishop makes it clear in no uncertain terms, you will not have anything to do with this, then I would say you have to offer up the obedience and suffer that white martyrdom inside the church. But if the bishop is like, well, I'm just not so sure, this is really a good idea, and he's kind of thinking out loud or a little more squishy on it, then I wouldn't construe that as a firm prohibition. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to be too Jesuitical, but I mean, is that what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Does it make good moral sense to you? So I think that again, these are peasants. A lot of these people are peasants. Most of the Cristero movement was in the peasant regions and not so much in the cities. Although it did, in Guadalajara it did. In Mexico City too, to some extent. But the point is, you've got a wife and family in your little parish church, and you've got guys breaking down the door to burn it down. Literally. What do? Use any force needed. I don't blame them. I don't blame them one iota. In fact, I I think what's wrong with you if you're able-bodied and won't do anything? Again, that goes back to Father Hardin's analysis of the situation, which I think is, frankly, again, I think Father Hardin has stated things with very, very great clarity and accuracy and very compelling. If you remember that discussion we had from what Father Hardin said about the necessity to give witness, right? I don't know, did I answer your question? I did, okay. Howard? Yeah.
I guess kind of playing off of that a little bit, kind of complicated, I guess, but, you know, if I remember correctly, like St. Thomas Aquinas talks about how there are certain instances where you are not obliged to obey even your bishop. I mean, like an obvious example, if he told you to do something immoral. But I mean, like, if a bishop, and I would imagine that no bishop, hopefully, you know, in Mexico at the time would have done this, would have forbidden you from even defending your life if a man was pointing a gun at you. You know, if the bishop was saying you can't even defend your life.
Yeah.
Like, I know that's really kind of, you know, difficult.
Yeah, and so what you're getting to there, and it actually makes perfect logical sense. And yes, St. Thomas does talk about that. One has to be very careful about such a topic, but it, again, is the natural law comes from God. The natural law came into existence when he created human nature. The natural law says what's good for us or bad for us as human beings, right? And that, right when God creates any nature, even the angelic nature, there's a natural law for angels because they are created beings, right? There's a natural law of gravity, there's a natural law for inanimate beings as well. So God creates these beings, he creates their powers, he creates their limitations, the things they can do, the things they can't do, the things that are good for them, the things that are not good for them. It's good for a fish to be in water all day, it's not good for us, right? So, but that natural law is created by God, that applies to us as human beings. In other words, the law of marriage is part of the natural law. No power below God can change that law. Does that make sense? No power below God can change the law of gravity, right? So when we have individuals or families or societies and nations and states and bigger and bigger and bigger, they have decisions that they can make. But one thing they cannot do is change human nature. And they cannot change natural law. And the right of self-defense, as we heard in the quotes tonight, is part of the natural law. So there you're saying, look, there is a higher law that I can appeal to here. Does that make sense? Okay, very good. Thank you all. Any other questions? I don't mean to rush you. I just know that we're probably getting really close on time at this point. 7:31. So are we good? All right. Well, I'll give you all a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti descendat super vos et maneat semper. Amen. Viva Cristo Rey.
Que viva.
You're getting better. All right.